Hello, everyone, to the last closing panel of the YSI UNCTAD Summer School. I know that it's been a very long but terrific set of sessions with some very, very interesting panels and some really quite profound insights from all the different scholars. But I think right now for the closing, we have an absolutely stellar panel lined up. So I'm really excited to be able to moderate this panel. I think we will get a very good discussion. Let me just introduce all the panelists one by one. We have Professor James Galbraith of the University of Texas at Austin, who is so well known that I hesitate. Well, everybody here is very well known, but he has done absolutely significant work on inequality, on neoliberalism, on a whole range of other things. And he's going to have some very important things to say. We then have Anne Pettifor from Great Britain, who is a very insightful and important thinker who's written this fabulous book on the Green New Deal, which I think everyone should really read, and which I hope is going to, some of these insights probably will come out in today's discussion. We have Andrès Arauz, who is also an economist from Ecuador, who has been very important in policy making. He's been in the central bank, he's been minister in many important portfolios, and he was, as you probably know, the presidential candidate in the latest election, who lost very, very narrowly at the last moment. We have Rob Davies from South Africa. He was the Minister for Trade and Industry, has huge experience in policy making over several stints, not just as minister, but also as part of various research and think tanks that have looked into development issues. And we have Isabella Weber, who I'm happy to say is also currently my colleague at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who has written this very important book on China, on how China escaped shock therapy, and has also done some very interesting work on economic diversification over a century, over the 19th and 20th centuries. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining this panel. And without further ado, I'm actually going to just begin by asking Jamie. Jamie, you wrote a really interesting piece on how neoliberalism is not dead in foreign policy quite recently. And I want you to talk a little bit about that, and also, in a sense, talk about another point you made in the Real World Economic Review, an article that's just out, where you talk about how economies are complex, and that complexity is often ignored, not just in analysis, but also in policy making, and that has very dire consequences. So could you please just elaborate on any of these?
Okay, these are simple questions, and I will be able to resolve them completely in the course of 90 seconds or so that's available to me. Is neoliberalism dead? Well, it depends upon the meaning of the word dead. This is a problem of medical definition. The electroencephalograph shows no activity. The pulse is still present. Is the patient dead? Well, yes, by one definition. There's not much more to expect from it, but on the other, it's not until you actually unplug the life support machinery that keeps all these neoliberal economists going and keeps the power structures that support them in place that it will be truly possible to say that the experiment is over and done with. Or to put it another way, what about let's take up the figure of Count Orlok, who was as Isabella will know, because Nosferatu is a German film of 1922. It was basically a derivative of Dracula in that movie. Was he dead? Actually, the parallels are quite strong if you think about what vampires do to their victims. I leave it to others to elucidate the gory details of this particular issue. So, stating things plainly, neoliberalism is stagnant, and it's been stagnant for at least half a century, maybe longer. It's a doctrine of equilibrium, of general equilibrium, of dynamic, stochastic general equilibrium, and these are non-existent phenomena in an evolving world, and the concepts that they apply to the actual world are useless because they cannot change as the world changes. Ex nihilo nihil fit. It's a catechism, in other words, of cooperative production and just distribution that was invented to align academic economics with a particular set of social and material interests. It's a Dr. Pangloss theory, if you like, but it is not dead because it serves this very powerful function, which is precisely the support of whatever hegemonic framework happens to exist at any given time. And that is why it was adopted by the American establishment, which had quite a different view in the 19th century. In the post-World War II period, it was adopted from the British because the Americans took over the British functions in the world. And that they therefore needed a doctrine to fit. And this was being economists, they always chose the one that was the least expensive to develop, which is the one that already existed. And essentially that's where we've been stuck for at least a half a century. So moving on from a world that's characterized by this sort of hegemonic structure, that from a doctrine that is essentially there to justify it and serves no other important purpose, would require ditching neoliberalism, that gets to the second part of your question, for an evolutionary approach. And this is also not a novel thing. This has been really rooted in the revolution of scientific thinking that began in the middle, at least in the middle of the 19th century, with the publication of The Origin of Species in 1859. And to bring it to the second article, the one that you mentioned that I just published in the Real World Economics Review, this is what underpins what I think is one of the crucial things for economists, and perhaps also young economists who have time to think in front of them, what they should be doing, which is rethinking the category schemes that we use, and not accepting the particular ones that have been handed down, and whether that's capital and labor or firms and households, these things are far too abstract and far too fixed to provide a truly useful way of analyzing the world in which we actually live. And as I say, rethinking them and restructuring them in a way which corresponds to in some ways to the social structures that actually exist in the world is what we should be trying to do. So Adam Smith wrote of capital, labor, and land or wages, or profits, wages, and rent, not because they were abstract, ageless things that he somehow inherited from time immemorial, but because they were the dominant social categories with which he was trying to describe in the society in which he was actually living. In ours, well, I mean, if you try and make sense of the world in terms of an infinity of abstract households with a particular set of utility functions and an infinity of infinitesimal abstract firms with particular production functions, good luck getting anywhere from there. What you need to do is to essentially those things are in fact imposed so as to squeeze out any concept of what social structure, international relations actually are. The specific categories that we should be using need to arise from observation of the world in which we live and the world in which we're trying to build. And that is a world which is pluralist, which has a diversity of organizations, in which these organizations evolve and develop, whether they're large organizations, the corporations that my father was preoccupied with, or cooperative structures, or structures of common governance, structures that help us deal with the actual problems that we face, including climate, including war and peace, including the pandemic. These are the things that we should be studying, dealing with, and addressing. And so the appeal of the second article is essentially economists need to be concerned with policy. Since everyone here is in fact that kind of an economist, interested, concerned with policy, concerned with the societies in which they live. I'll desist on this point and yield back any remaining time if I haven't already absorbed more than my share. Thank you.
Wow, Jamie, you actually managed to answer both these huge questions in 5 minutes. So
that's the training of a congressional staffer.
That's terrific. Thanks. You mentioned dealing with contemporary challenges. And of course, obviously the pandemic, yes, but climate change. And I know that Anne has written a lot about this, about how we deal with this. And especially from the developing world where I am right now, it seems one of those insuperable problems. It seems something that is, people are even fatalistic, like they are about the third wave of the pandemic. They're saying, oh, well, climate change is going to happen anyway. We are doomed. We can't do anything. You have provided a lot of antidote to that in your book, Anne. So can you tell us a bit about that? You're
easier
muted.
if you unmute yourself, Anne.
Oh dear, when will we ever learn? So first of all, can I thank you, Jayati and Richard, for including me on this really wonderfully distinguished panel. I'm really humbled to be here. Yeah, my preoccupation is with, as Jamie mentioned, structures, and in particular, the structure of the international system, because I'm convinced, and COVID-19 has convinced me even further, that it's not possible to address these big issues unless we are able to transform the system which prevents us from collaborating, coordinating, and bringing about transformation in health, for example. I mean, what was so striking about 2020 was the total inability of world leaders to work together, to collaborate behind the WHO to address a global pandemic. And that's because of neoliberalism, or as Susan Cassell said so eloquently earlier this week, the way in which neoliberalism has evolved to give enormous power to those who own intangibles, like, for example, the software, the intellectual property behind pharmaceuticals. So we have to change that system. And I was very struck also by Eric Helleiner's contribution to the summer school when he said that when he was asked by Richard what he thought, as you've asked, Jayati, about the possibility of a global Green New Deal. And Eric said, we had to face the fact that change happens incrementally, that institutions and policies take decades to change. And that enraged me, really, because right now I'm preoccupied by the 50th anniversary of the Nixon shock, which occurs on the 15th of August, exactly 50 years ago, when Nixon overnight and almost single-handedly, with the help of Schultz and Volcker and others, transformed the whole international system. And it's still the transformed system that we live under today. And he did it overnight, literally, and without consultation, and of course, without collaboration. So what we saw there wasn't incremental change, it was transformational change, and it happened in a great hurry. So I think that transformational change is possible. The question is, where is the tipping point? The question is, what will be the thing that will cause that to happen? Who will lead it? And that's another big question. And, I'm not dewy-eyed about this. Clearly, getting the kind of transformational system we need to address a global crisis such as climate breakdown and biodiversity collapse. And the scientists are on the point of panic in talking to us about this. Everybody's dreading the IPCC report on Monday because we know that the story is going to be really frightening. And scientists like the biologists that have written the paper on the sixth extinction are arguing that actually we are at a point where we could, where human civilization itself could collapse. And as opposed to climate change, where we can perhaps alter temperatures, we can perhaps sequestrate carbon, if we collapse our extinctions, that is irreversible. And that would lead to the collapse of human civilization. But there isn't a sense of urgency yet to achieve that. Now, one of the reasons, I think, is because the failure of the left to grasp the whole question of the international system. And I've been working with Jeff Tiley, who's the senior economist at the TUC here, who's talked about, quite rightly, he's analyzed this as the left being tied into, and by the left I mean social democracy, I suppose, but also many on even the harder left, if you like, sort of have been kind of colluded in and co-opted the whole globalization story, really. And globalization, argues Jeff, is actually a form of internationalism for the 1%. The whole point about globalization is that it has been constructed, and let's face it, it has been constructed to serve the interests of wealth. What he's arguing for is that we should have a new internationalism, which should be the internationalism of labor, broadly speaking. And what strikes me is that everywhere the left isn't talking about that sort of internationalism. We care about what happens in the South, we care about those countries, but we're not, for example, celebrating, I think it's the 150th anniversary of the writing of the Internationale, right? This is a thing that's unknown to many people. The kind of internationalism that Rosa Luxemburg was committed to, for example, is not even discussed on the left anymore. And I really want us to do that because, this thinking has to predate any transformation. And if we're not even thinking about it, if we're confined to our domestic politics, if we're confined to a form of globalization that is for the 1%, we're not going to get that change. We've got to start. And one of the things I want us to talk about, and I'd like to talk about at length here, is the Nixon shock of 15th of August, 1971, because it's been, and again, I want to mention it because I first had my attention drawn to it by Yilmaz Akuz back in the early 90s, who talked about it as the biggest sovereign default in history. Now, as someone who was very preoccupied with sovereign debt and the sovereign debt of low-income countries, I found this astonishing. And Yilmaz is quite right. It was a sovereign default. It was the refusal of the United States of America to repay its foreign obligations in gold, which is what it had been committed to do. And because Nixon was unwilling to structurally adjust the US economy to restore it to balance, because that was going to cost him votes, we are landed with at first a chaotic system, which was then consolidated by the neoliberals in today's globalization. And unless we talk about it, and that's why I'm so glad to have this opportunity here to talk about it, I want to see us talking about a new kind of internationalism, a new kind of international solidarity, collaboration and coordination to tackle these big challenges. And perhaps the biggest challenge of all is Wall Street, never mind climate change. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And that is so fascinating. And you're right. I also had forgotten about this important anniversary and the fact that it was a unilateral, sudden shock decision that was so transformative. But of course, it reflects relative power, doesn't it? And Andrès, you've been at the receiving end of all these power imbalances globally. I mean, Ecuador is a dollarized economy. You run an institute that is studying the impact of dollarization. You have had to deal with the impact of financial flows and the way global finance has been structured, as Anne said, to deal with the interests of the 1%. So what is your take on what is possible today?
Hi, Jayati. Again, thank you for the invitation. Thanks everybody at YSI and UNCTAD. I'm also one of those young scholars who was a member and participated in several groups and summer schools a while ago as well. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm gonna take Anne's transformational change cue to mention just a few things that have happened and occurred in the last decades in Latin America and the relationship to all these constraints that mobile finance poses on development initiatives in Latin America. But, just like the Nixon shock for the world system, we can't forget the Volcker shock when interest rates were raised, over a couple of weeks to ridiculous levels. And I'm actually very fearful that this may happen, in the 21st century version of it after the pandemic, when we have totally uneven recovery efforts in the South versus the North. and also how that may translate into monetary policy that may end up, creating a couple of lost decades for the South. So we really have to be careful about those negative transformational changes, at least from our perspective. But I also think that we should be in a moment where there are opportunities for transformational changes. For example, the workings of the international investor state dispute settlement system, right? I mean, we have seen how ISDS via ICSID and the Permanent Court of Arbitration that bases on UNCTAD rules are, stopping basically and generating a chilling effect on measures that could become part of a Green New Deal, and how that is really stopping countries from implementing measures that combat climate change. That basically implies confronting the big energy companies of the world. And as you mentioned, international capital, the role of the dollar in the world and in our domestic economies, we have seen now a phenomenon such as treaty shopping and jurisdiction shopping, where these absurd tax evading energy and mining offshore companies based in havens are suing countries based on these bilateral investment treaties and the investment chapters of the free trade agreements. And this is really, really, really bad because it's probably the worst part of the investor state system, and basically is threatening to use these tools that only favor capital. I mean, there's no doubt about that, against the developing countries at a moment such as this one, the pandemic crisis. But then you have these nasty cross-default clauses where, if a country doesn't pay one of those awards, the arbitration awards, it's considered in default. And the cross-default clause is considered that you're defaulting on the entire sovereign debt as well. So it really becomes a nasty system that is becoming a major threat for countries in terms of their development initiatives, especially in Latin America, the region that has the most arbitrations filed against it. I would also like to talk about capital flight in the sense that mobile finance basically is a way of disciplining countries and governments and policymakers into adopting neoliberal economic policies and making capital flight and vulnerabilities to domestic economies even a more profound mark on the structure of their systems, which both facilitates speculative flight attacks from abroad and capital flight from the domestic elites at the same time. And we have this sort of coalition of classes that is definitely a constraint on policymaking for countries. I mean, just look at what's happening right now in both Colombia and Peru, Ecuador's neighbors. In the case of Colombia, the whole discussion, even unfortunately on the left, is how to behave correctly so that they are well liked by the bondholders abroad, and all the discussion is about the credit rating. And the protests are even about, how can the right-wing government have allowed the markets to consider Colombia bonds to be junk bonds and so on. It's really, really interesting. And in Peru, with the new leftist government, the discussion is, well, is the new Peruvian president going to sack the central bank president who's been in there since 2006, Mr. Velarde? And that is the major discussion in the domestic media, the domestic establishment, the domestic policymaking circles. So it really shows the degree of penetration that capital and this disciplining via mobile capital has affected domestic policymaking now. When you think about it, mobile finance is basically offshore finance, which even if you enter the discussion, through the different levels of development, we're talking about accountability and rule of law. Because unfortunately, in Latin America, when you talk about offshore finance, you're also talking about tax evasion, you're also talking about corruption, you're talking about illicit campaign financing. And I mean, just look at Miami. It's the center of offshore finance in Latin America, where corrupt payments are processed. Just look at the properties of the Latin American elites in the South Florida. And even the assassination of President Moise in Haiti was financed in Miami. This is all clearly demonstrated now. So it really it's a very important point to think about, and so on. Now, on the proposal side, and I want to be very, very brief, we need new transformations quickly, very quickly in place to get around this. So we need, new accounting for both for businesses and for macroeconomics. We need regional financial integration, looking for regional sovereignties. We need procurement policies for industrialization that think of this new, like Anne said, positive way of globalizing labor, globalizing the possibility of development. We really need to rethink how fintech is occupying the discussion around the world only about cross-border finance and cross-border payments, instead of talking about development fintech. We really have to think about that, especially for young scholars. And we need to build sovereign digital ecosystems, transactional systems, ID systems, messaging systems, open innovation systems, and so on. And I would just like to conclude on an alert. I'm not writing about this right now, but it's being from a dollarized country, it's very, very scary to think that if Federal Reserve CBDC, central bank digital currency, is issued, people are thinking about all the properties about it. But if you think about how that becomes a threat for capital flight from Latin America to the US and from the South to the US, can you imagine anybody, even the middle class, being able to simply open an account in US dollars is really a scary thought. So there's a lot of food for thought there.
Wow, yes, Andrés, so many issues that have come up in there. And I'm getting the feeling of being gauged almost, the developing countries really, there is all these different constraints, including the ones coming from new technology that you mentioned just now. Rob, you've been at the receiving end of that as well, right? You have had to deal with an international architecture that is inherently skewed against an industrializing economy. And you've managed to negotiate at least a little bit something. So, how does it work? What are the current constraints? What can you do to overcome them?
Well, let me thank you very much, first of all, for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I'm very honored to be able to do so. But let me also just say that I think that the perspectives which are being developed by progressive forces in the trade arena, which I'll speak to, are taking place in a particular context. And this context, I think, is very important. The theme that we are supposed to all be speaking to is about a transition away from a hegemonic world. And I think that where I'm standing and looking at the issue from a trade slant, if you like, I think that we can see that the hegemony that was established and consolidated at the end of the Cold War and exemplified in the hyperglobalization and neoliberalism, we can see it's on the wane, but it's not dead yet. And the new order is not yet in place. And in the meantime, we've seen, as Gramsci would have called it, a series of morbid symptoms. And those are very, very evident in the trade arena. So one of the things that I think has been very, very important has been the rise of China. So the rise of China, not, as I'm sure Isabella will tell us, following the neoliberal playbook, but precisely not following the neoliberal playbook, has been able to lift hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty and become a very significant player, including a significant player in the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, to the point where it is challenging the still existing hegemonic powers in that regard. And I think that this has given rise to what I sometimes call a bipolar disorder, where departures from the neoliberal playbook are being sought and being acted on by the big and powerful players, but the rest of us continue to be preached neoliberalism, and we are expected to follow the neoliberal playbook. So we've seen, for example, a series of measures taken to try to curtail China in the technology space, measures which are unilateral in character, which are quite frankly against the rule book as it has been constructed. And at the same time, as the rest of us are all being constrained to actually conform more. And this is giving rise to a view and a perspective which we saw a kind of a crude form from the Trump administration, a more sophisticated version now emerging from the European Union in a paper which they published in February this year, calling for a more assertive trade policy, in which they basically seeking to rebalance the international trading system yet further against the interests of developing countries. This is under the rubric of reform. And the reform is argued in terms of, well, China has introduced competitive distortions, that's the phrase used, into the international trading system. And these need to be countered by tightening up rules which do not allow so-called emerging economies to have access to special and differential treatment, which seek to further constrain the role of public institutions in industrial policy under the rubric of getting state-owned companies to become competitively neutral, that seek to tighten up rules on other forms of industrial policy, and at the same time allow the majors to form little groups on their own, develop issues, bring them partly cooked into the WTO and impose them on the rest of us. That's the sort of reform agenda that's been sought. And this is all against the background, I think, of an ideology which I think was well captured by Danny Roderick, where he said that to all intents and purposes, trade had become the sort of substitute for a developmental strategy. And I think that when we use the word trade in that context, we need to actually understand that there's a conceptual elision, that when people talk about trade in this sort of context, they don't mean trade per se, they don't mean engaging in international trade, they certainly don't mean taking a strategic approach to trade guided by your industrial policy. They mean that you must adopt trade liberalization and that you must support the sort of hyper-globalization approach and a extreme neoliberal approach. That's what they mean by trade. And there's a sort of assumption that free trade fundamentalism is the solution to all the world's problems, that climate change, the solution there is that we have free trade in environmental goods, which would not allow the rest of us to become producers of the new technologies, but mere consumers. The issue of participating in global value chains is not really whether we're in or out of them. Most of us are in them. The problem is most of the developing world is in them in the position we always were as producers and exporters of primary commodities at a time when the value of the commodity in the final product is diminishing, particularly as we go into higher tech products. So I think all of these factors have created really a crisis for the system and a huge disjuncture, just exemplified by the fact that the vaccine apartheid, which we've seen, is linked to the reality that intellectual property was mentioned. Intellectual property is very much beyond what it's supposed to be justified in terms of a reward for innovation. It's now a license for monopoly conduct, including decisions about pricing and access to products and so on. And I think that the evident solution is that we need much more of a multiplicity of production and not just some kind of rules about supply and liberalization of markets and stuff like that. And the same with the environmental goods issue. So I think that a number of us, and I think the views have been expressed in a number of papers and positions, which I'll refer to in a moment, have decided that we need to come into this discussion, not by, as it were, simply sort of opposing what's been said and saying that, well, the existing multilateral system is what we want, because we don't want that, because it has delivered unjust and unequal outcomes in the past. But actually that we need to be more proactive and define an alternative, which I think is much more in line with a world which is more inclusive, which is more developmental in focus, and which is more capable, I think, of addressing the big mega challenges of climate change and the digital industrial revolution. And so ministers in 2019, some ministers from the developing world, we adopted a perspective in India, in Delhi, which called for reform for inclusivity and development. There's been a definition of some what are called Geneva principles, which have attempted to give some flesh to that. And then more recently, Richard, myself, contributed as well to a paper which UNCTAD produced, in which we try to outline in a bit more detail some of the things that we think are essential. And I think that they are to say that this kind of substitution of development for trade has to be completely reversed. We need to understand that development is the fundamental objective. That means human development, but it also means development of the productive forces and a recognition that those countries which have lifted their people out of poverty have been those that have moved into higher value-added production and have been industrialized. And that means that we need to be able to have access to policy space to allow us, because the measures at the moment, while initially targeting China, are also going to cut off any kind of possibility for the rest of us to do anything similar to not just China, but every other industrializing country any time in economic history, including the United States at the end of the 19th century. So I think that that's one of the first things, is to preserve the policy space, allow the policy space to take place, to preserve the rights to special and differential treatment, not to have this kind of behind the border issues which are becoming increasingly important. I think I agree with all the points made about the Global Green New Deal, and also the points made by Andrès Arauz about the bilateral investment treaties, and that here we have a situation in which every ordinary measure that is there for human welfare or development is subject to rules which have absolutely nothing to do with it, and which actually constrain our policy space. Then we also need to have a multilateralism which is not based on what you see in the trade negotiating space, where it is, you're fighting for vested interests from your national countries. We need to have a view of voice, solidarity, and a kind of a collective response to challenges and problems. And then we have to use this moment of the COVID crisis and the looming climate change crisis to try to mold a different approach to those kinds of issues. I mean, the call to recover better has got to go along with allowing developing countries to have, as I already said, a much more significant role in production, including of environmental goods. I mean, here's another form of bipolarism, because while you want us to liberalize towards environmental goods, at the same time, the majors are asserting the right for them to decide in the form of border adjustment taxes that if they don't think that you've gone sufficiently far, they will penalize your products through punitive taxes. So I think these are the approaches that we need to follow. Now, obviously, the issue is that we're operating in a very unfavorable balance of forces, but I do think that the fact that the narrative, the grand narrative, at least I would argue, of neoliberalism doesn't have the persuasive power that it had, has given us an opportunity to create and develop alternatives, and that's the way we need to go. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rob. That laid out so many excellent principles for a more plausible and progressive future. But a lot China has been mentioned several times already in this discussion. And of course, it's not just China right now, which the West has suddenly focused on and realized is a big threat or whatever they see it as. But the fact that China was able to do this extraordinary transformation, really, of its economy during a period of what was global neoliberalism. And I think that's really interesting. The political economy of that is absolutely fascinating. And it's something that Isabella has talked about in tremendous, very fascinating detail in her book. Isabella, I know it's too much to ask you to summarize that, but can you give us some of those highlights?
Thanks so much, Jayati, and also thanks to WiseEye and UNCTAD for the invitation. It's exceedingly humbling to be on this panel. I was a young scholar myself not too long ago and might still be considered a young scholar. So thank you. In my book, I go back to the 1980s crossroads, which is not at an anniversary right now, but still I think is crucial to understand the current moment, the moment of challenging neoliberalism. So in the 1980s in China, it was clear that a trajectory of more market was the way to go. However, it was not clear how to go about this. And in this context, basically two sides were contesting. On the one hand, the neoliberal side that proposed a logic very similar to what we have come to know as shock therapy, that suggests that the core of the old system had to be destroyed in the first place and as quickly as possible in order to make space for the market. On the other hand, gradualist experimentalism that ultimately prevailed suggested that one had to unleash market dynamics first in the non-essential parts of the system and to maintain the institutions of the old planned economy in the first instance, thus creating a dual-track system of market and the old system operating in tandem in the first place. These institutions of the old system were then used as market creators, market movers, and market participants, and the state maintained its tight control and steering role in the commanding heights of the economy. So not following the neoliberal policy prescript in a wholesale fashion was a precondition for China's economic rise. At the same time, using the key institutions of the old system was crucial to China's success. So in that sense, the foundations laid during the Maoist period in terms of industrialization, public health, literacy, building up of a planning apparatus and so on were ultimately crucial. That's why not doing shock therapy, not killing the core was an essential precondition. That of course also included economic sovereignty and political sovereignty that had been achieved before the dawn of reform. So key to China's success was the recognition that there was a core of the old system that had to be preserved and that had to be transformed, in fact, in what I think is transformational change through incremental change. So what does this mean for other developing countries? Of course, I can only present preliminary thoughts here, but I think it does add to the insight that not following the neoliberal paradigm is a precondition for success. Of course, it's only a precondition. At the same time, I think that China's specific trajectory suggests that there's no such thing as copying a China model, but that in fact, the method of China's own economic reform is one that precludes the possibility of wholesale adaptation or wholesale copying. So it suggests that it requires to start from the local condition, from an assessment of one's own path, history, institutions, strengths, and weaknesses, in order to then introduce experimental change. Thereby, experiments are not like RCAs, like micro kind of exercises, but rather they are part of a larger project of development. In light of all the structural international constraints that we have been talking about, and that Jayati, I think, very aptly called the perception of being caged, I've started to think about this in terms of guerrilla warfare, where it's really about trying to think of little pieces where holes can be poked into the system. In fact, as I argue in the book, in the 1980s, China's first generation revolutionary leaders constantly argued that China had to go back to the strategies of economic warfare of the 1940s and the insights of guerrilla economic warfare. Thank you very much.
That is so fascinating, this idea of the guerrilla warfare, because, you know, this leads directly into a question that is coming out from all of your excellent interventions, which is that, you know, we are in a way globally in a kind of uncharted territory. I think it was already mentioned by Rob, by Andrès, that and Jamie said it, right? It's neoliberalism is on life support. And it's really being propped up somehow by these desperate policies of central bank and government fiscal policy in the north and so on. But on the other hand, the legal and institutional structures that push it on the developing world are very, very strong and active. So what do we do? What's available for the developing world today? The ones who, unfortunately, some did shock therapy, the others got gradually pushed into it, whatever. Many of us in the developing world are now stuck in this bind. So my question to all of you now is, in this world where there seems to be this tension between internationalism, which we all want in the progressive sense, and nationalism, which is not just rampant in the north, but the response and reaction to that in the south is inevitable. Is there a way to use some positive forms of quote unquote nationalism to protect domestic industry, or regionalism to generate the multiplicity of production that Rob talked about, or just playing on these geopolitical differences and conflicts? Because, you know, if G7 is not going to deliver, why not look to other poles for different options? So my question to you now really is, okay, what do developing countries do in this context? Jamie, I know you were very important in advising China during their reform. And of course, you know, there's a big difference between you advising China and Jeff Sachs advising some of the shock therapy countries. So what would you advise a country to do today?
Well, when I got to China in 1993, much of the die had been cast, and the story has been told in Isabella's book about what happened there in the 1980s. To the extent that I had a role, it was largely in stretching out the period before the neoliberal forces in China became so strong that they could actually disrupt the development process, which in fact, in the end, as Isabella tells, they were. It was manageable, and you had the results that the world sees. But what we observe is that large countries that are governed in a pragmatic way can defy the neoliberal agenda. Small countries that are subject to divide and conquer have much more difficulty, and I suspect that Andrès can tell us a little bit about that. So what has to happen is for the smaller countries have to band together. They have to have a regional framework which is independent of the neoliberal agenda. And you can see that happening. It's certainly possible for it to happen in Latin America. It requires Latin America, unfortunately, is a bit close to the neoliberal centers of power, so it's more difficult, but it's still not impossible. It can certainly happen throughout Asia. It is in fact happening, I think, as throughout Asia, can happen in Eurasia. And it can happen in Africa. So we have the potential for this, but you know, what essentially the neoliberal power is a financial power, and the financial power has certain points which can be regulated, can be controlled. This is you have leverage over debt, you have leverage over capital flows if you can administer them in a way which is which favors the development projects. So one has I think that the people have been working on this for a long time. I like very much the work of my friend Luis Carlos Pérez Pereira, the new developmentalism that he advances, which is essentially similar to the development of the Chinese model, which is to say one goes open to trade and technology, but keeping predatory capital flows under control is at least one essential element. The other one is having, as Isabella just said, having a policy which is oriented toward social stability, development, environmental goals in such a way that you have some control over the flow of resources and the stabilization in the face of crises that come from abroad. So all of this does. I mean, the structure of the world's countries is in fact not accidental, and some of this has to be overcome, and if it can't be overcome with the cooperation of the institutions that were created originally for stabilizing purposes, but were really subverted in the 1970s and 80s, the IMF and the World Bank, then it should be done by parallel institutions that are created for the precise purpose of doing what those institutions should have done. It's interesting. I won't go on to too much length, but I had experience in Greece in 2015. And at that time, even the research department of the IMF was admitting that what they were doing, what they had done was not working. That didn't change one iota what the troika of the IMF, the European Commission, European Central Bank was imposing on Greece. Not a bit. And you realize that what was really happening was not a development strategy or a stabilization strategy, but a strategy of debt collection and asset seizure. And that was very clear. And I expect that my colleagues on the panel have plenty of experience with parallel phenomena.
So, you know, this is absolutely true. Thank you for bringing back the possibility of policy agency, you know, because otherwise it's so easy to be just completely weighed down. But then there is the matter of urgency, which Anne raised. And you very correctly pointed out that this is actually an existential crisis for humanity. And if you don't act soon, you know, basically there's a possibility that humanity ceases to exist. How do we make things happen soon? What's the possibility for some kind of global, I don't even know what to call it, cooperation, global working together in some way? And what can people do in different countries to make that happen?
So yes, what is to be done question. It's really difficult to sort of gather the right correlation of forces, as I call it, to get together and decide to go forward. But it should have been last year. No, it's very unfortunate that last year we had the Trump administration in the White House, because it was a moment for really transformational change. I think, I mean, I don't want to be a permanent pessimist, but I think that a different kind of administration last year would have made a difference in the world, because of, you know, the juncture that the pandemic implied. But I think for now, what I think we can manage is basically two things. One, a new push for regional integration in Latin America is something that is feasible within the short term. There is the adequate amount of forces within the region to make that happen, to make that occur. I think now the leadership of President López Obrador in Mexico is very, very, very key. And I think he's already made a clear decision to go forward with this regional integration, focused on knowledge, focused on science, focused on creating a different development paradigm for the region. And I think that together with the last effort that we lived in the first part of the 21st century, I think Latin America will go forward swiftly in terms of a new type of regional integration that's been advocated by, you know, UNCTAD as well during the last few decades. So I think there's a lot of effort that has to be put in there. And I'm personally going to put in a lot of effort for that as well. Second, I think that spaces such as the Progressive International are a signal of something that has to occur as well. You know, I also belong to that space, and it's basically the coordination of progressive forces, not only in one region, not only of the South, not only of the North, but around the world. And this internationalism is very important, because we're not only talking about a country or a policy or a group of people, we're talking about the entire planet, we're talking about the entire species. So I think we need further coordination. There is so much to learn in terms of knowledge exchanges, strategies, activism, the possibility, but also how I like to think of it is to focus on the strategic nodes of power of the neoliberal hegemonic system, and to focus our energy on those strategic nodes of power. And I'm talking about, you know, the offshore system, the ISDS system, you know, several nodes of power in the trade system, and look for those gatekeepers and do it head on, you know, because I think if we can act based on this sort of strategic logic, instead of fighting every fight or every struggle, but focusing on the places where they are probably weakest now, but they have these protective codes around them, we can perhaps get some transformational change done in the short term.
That is so interesting, and that kind of feeds into an issue that I know Anne Pettifor has been talking about a lot, which is about how we can actually finance a global Green New Deal. And in a way, you know, Anne, you have been talking about how we can use existing structures, but also change particular structures and change their orientation to actually make this possible. Yeah.
So I'm very loath to give advice to people like Andrès and Rob, who are actually there, you know, at the frontier of these problems. And it's easy for me, I feel, from my ivory tower to talk about this, but I want to use my own experience with the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which took place some years ago. But what was central to that campaign was a coalition, a North-South coalition. And the power of the coalition was that the North had power that often the Southern countries lacked. They were, if you like, on the creditor's doorstep, and they could imply pressure on the creditor in a way the debtor couldn't. And it was that mixing of those powers and that joining together of movements which forced the IMF, the World Bank, the Paris Club to write off debts and acknowledge that these debts would never be paid, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't perfect by any means, and I'm not celebrating it, but I'm talking about the power of those coalitions. Now, from my point of view, And I heard what Andrès said about those specific. I still think those, you know, the ISDS thing is still very complicated. But here in Britain, we have a central bank, and Americans have a central bank that are public institutions financed by taxpayers, and with technocrats that are on the taxpayers' payroll, if you like, on the government's payroll. Let's forget about all this nonsense about independent central banks, right? That's our leverage. The fact is that it's our taxes, our resources that are being used to support, to mainly nationalize Wall Street when Wall Street is in trouble, right? And I think we have to, I would like to, and this sounds reactionary because it is in many places, I'd like a taxpayers alliance to say, sorry, but the taxpayer is no longer going to provide the infrastructure that keeps private finance making massive capital gains. No, you know, while we make the sacrifices of having our services cut and our jobs lost and so on and so forth. So, you know, I mean, taxpayers in low-income countries, in my view, would probably have less leverage, mainly because tax institutions in low-income countries, very many of them are very weak. But, you know, if we combined our powers, you know, if we had a movement in Britain to say, thou shalt not bail out Wall Street, the City of London, and all the mistakes that they're making, private equity, thou shalt not subsidize, sponsor, et cetera. And we will, you know, we've got some leverage over our own public institutions. And so I'd like to see a coalition across the world on that basis. But, you know, and that's why I, like Andrès, look so much forward to Progressive International. But come the COVID crisis, we didn't manage to form that coalition. We didn't manage to come together to apply leverage to the pharmaceutical companies in our own countries, to the governments that were sponsoring those pharmaceutical companies in the development of vaccines and using our taxpayers' money to do that. And then watch them, charging very high prices for the product, and secondly, declining to license the product in countries like the country of my birth, South Africa, you know. So for me, the answer is in those international coalitions, but those international coalitions to be, you know, understand their power and to use that power. But that may sound a little bit too easy for people who are actually on, you know, facing the threats that so many low-income countries now face.
So Rob, that's a direct lead on to your position on this, because you have actually had to face this. And so you know the spaces and you know what can be done and played against one another. So please tell us what you think about this.
Well, first of all, let me just say that I think that you know, the scenarios is not just a new form of multilateralism or nationalism. I think we should also take into account the possibility of bloc formation, and a new kind of Cold War with much conditional access to technologies and resources and stuff like that. So I think that's another scenario we need to take account of. But I do want to agree with a few things that have been said. I think one of the paths forward has to be regional integration. And on the African continent, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has already been, the architecture has been agreed and the process of implementation has started. And I think that creates the possibility, because one of the things about Africa, and probably a bit like Latin America, but unlike India, for example, is that colonialism divided us into small countries. And none of us has the sort of basis on which we can on our own have a kind of a value chain that's going to support a deep transformation of our productive economies. But as a continent, we do start to have the numbers. We have the numbers of population that sort of match India, and GDP is, you know, kind of common GDP is getting there as well. So I think those are the issues. But whether that fulfills its potential or not depends on the paradigms. And I think in the case of Africa, there's a kind of an ill-concealed sort of clash of paradigms. You know, there are those who see regional integration as merely trade integration, orthodox trade integration, and that it's back to the old trade will develop without anything else, and that's the driver. We've also got I think there's so many external parties that want to push something called open regionalism, where we would be the integration in the region would be a stepping stone to opening up to them. In which case the main beneficiaries would be not producers in the continent, but people outside of the continent who are going to export products, finished products into the continent. And so, you know, there's a voice around, and there's an academic literature, and there's a debate and a discussion. I'm involved in a lot of this about developmental regionalism, in which, you know, the fundamental aim of regionalism is to create regional value chains on a scale that's going to support industrialization. With some of the different possible candidates, but one of the obvious ones for early action is the pharmaceutical industry, where the vaccine apartheid has shown us exactly what this existing regime has created. Then I want to say that I do think that all the things that have been mentioned, you know, the Progressive International, things like that, what they are important, and what they reflect is that, you know, a few years ago, 10 years ago, we never had anything like this. There wasn't anything that was challenging the dominant paradigm. And now we are in a better space in that regard. And I think these things all need to be built on. But one of the other things that I think is really, really critical is the Global Green New Deal. If we're going to hear on Monday that there's a catastrophic situation coming towards us, and that you know, what we've agreed on now is not going to crack it, which is what I suspect is going to be the case. That needs to be a moment where we actually mobilize and build around, because, you know, one of the things I know in South Africa, and I imagine it's the case with many other developing countries, when we went to Paris and agreed on the targets in Paris, you know, the sort of mantra that was given to us was, well, it's all well within the existing trajectories and it's not going to be hugely disruptive. Well, there have actually been studies in South Africa now which say that actually a significant part of your assets are going to be decommissioned, whether you like it or not, even if you don't like it, as a result of just the agreements that have been reached in Paris. And so I think the question that's going to loom large is, yes, we need to make this transition, but how are we going to make it in an architecture where all the benefits are going to flow to the existing rich, and where the rest of us are going to be left carrying obligations? And where, by the way, I think another thing that's really, really important is that, you know, even if we do reach some kind of agreement on something that's going to save us from human extinction, that's a big if, but even if we manage that, we are going to face climate change. And climate change is going to be disruptive to our environments, and we better start building for that, because, you know, if we're going to just simply wait for you know, coastal cities to be completely inundated, we're going to have to deal with that afterwards. Or we can deal with it with infrastructure build programs and things like that in advance, and that this is going to require a different kind of multilateralism. So I think this could be a big trigger, and the Global Green New Deal approach is giving us, I think, the signposts for something that could happen. But in the end of the day, it's a matter of politics, and it's a matter of organization. It's a matter of building coalitions and all of that. It's not granted that one scenario or another will unfold. We can see the scenarios. We have to work towards the one we want.
That's absolutely true. But you know, Rob, you mentioned this other possibility of bloc formation. And so, Isabella, clearly, this is the big thing that is happening in the world today. It's, you know, US or US European Union or G7 versus China in a way. How do you see this unfolding? Do you think that there are possibilities for this to not erupt into a new Cold War with devastating consequences, or that there are possibilities for the developing world to take advantage of the fact that there is a China that has now new technology and new ways of, you know, organizing production and distribution?
Yeah, thank you. I don't think I'm in a position to lecture anyone here on development policy, but let me just say that what makes me really concerned is that in the middle of the pandemic, there was no way to collaborate with China on the most basic things, things like distributing masks, right? Instead of saying, oh, great that China is exporting masks to the countries that need them most urgently, they were blamed for mask diplomacy, as if this was primarily geostrategic, which makes me quite pessimistic about the outlook of collaborating on things that are less tangible immediate urgency. On how this plays out in smaller developing countries, I think Andrès is so much better positioned, or Rob Davies, to speak on this, that I should rather not say anything. I wanted to put out one other point that I think might be of some relevance. That is that in the Chinese context, I think part of not pursuing the neoliberal strategy was also not pursuing the idea that free prices are optimal prices, and that economic policy is basically macroeconomic policy, that stabilization policy is basically macroeconomic stabilization policy, but that instead there's a whole complex structure of institutions that stabilize important prices in terms of industrial and consumer goods through buffer stocks and state participation in important markets. And picking up on Jayati's piece in foreign policy and the danger of stagflation as a result of rising commodity prices in the global south, in particular food prices. And if we take this together with the threats of climate change, which clearly will disrupt the production of food and basic raw materials and so on, right? So we are in for massive commodity price volatility. So I think in that context, the Chinese experience might give some credibility to reviving some of the post-war proposals on creating international commodity buffer stocks for price stabilization, not as a solution to development, but as one step towards creating some more space by avoiding massive volatility. Thank you.
Yes,
Let me come in on a couple of points, if I might.
Sure, JB. Yeah.
Just to pick up on what Isabella just said, we're having a lot of discussion in the US these days about inflation. And it's interesting, it's almost all in the mindset of the 1960s, of a closed economy driven internally by wage pressures. Not at all what's going on. As Isabella has just pointed out, this is a worldwide phenomenon based in the commodities markets, based upon changes in the pattern of demand, in the supply chain, disruptions in the supply chain, and climate questions. And this requires an international initiative. It would not be dealt with if we react to it the way we did in the 1970s by raising interest rates, just make the matter worse. Understanding the details, in other words, is essential in not getting brainwashed by the statistics. Second point I want to make about this question about a Cold War between the US and China. Well, there's clearly a strong push in that direction, that the policy space is full of a toxic rhetoric. But there's still, I saw a very interesting White House document that was published in June on the supply chain. It was an evaluation of 4 key sectors. And I wrote a paper on this that was published by the Institute for New Economic Thinking. If you pick up, for example, the case of the semiconductor industry, it's a very crucial industry in which these things are embedded in practically everything we use. The conclusion of the White House's own report, which was prepared, I forget, the Department of Commerce perhaps, but in any event, was that anything that happens that disrupts trade between the US and China is going to destroy the American semiconductor industry. Why? Because 50% of the market for semiconductors is in China, right? They're the users, and they package them for sale to the rest of the world in the final products. So the profits and the investment possibilities of the industry-leading design firms, which are American, depend upon sales to China. And even worse, a very substantial part of the fabrication is done in something called contract foundries, which are located on Taiwan. So anything that disrupts trade across the Taiwan Strait or disrupts the normal relations that are going on right now is catastrophic for the semiconductor industry as a whole. And so one has to recognize that on the other side of the rhetoric, there's some very substantial economic realities here that people don't like to talk about because they put you in a disadvantaged position politically if you're not showing off how tough you are. But they are there, and they're not going to go away. And I think at the end of the day, there, of course, the world can blow itself up and has done so on numerous occasions in the past. But there ought to be cool heads who are willing to point this kind of thing out. It was interesting.
So,
it was interesting to see that in the
yeah.
White House document. That's exactly what happened.
This is a fascinating discussion and we could go on for hours, but I realize we're coming to the end of our time and we have some really interesting questions. I'm so sorry because of bad time management. I'm just going to pick up a couple of these questions and ask you if you would like to consider them in your closing statements. And I'm afraid your closing statements, you're going to kill me for this, have to be within 1 or 2 minutes. I'm so sorry. But there's a question on regional integration. Rob, you might like to consider that. It's theoretically a good idea, but are there going to be winners and losers in Africa? And how do you deal with that? Similarly, Andrés is being asked, should Ecuador enter the Alianza del Pacífico? Should it join Mercosur? What would it gain or lose? There is, of course, the whole issue about whether even these regional integration projects are neoliberal in orientation. And there are some questions about whether we're just skirting the issue of capitalism as such, whether we're talking about neoliberalism, whereas basically the problem is capitalism. And there's a question from Fernando Santor about, are there profits and competition go hand in hand? And we are talking about a less predatory economy, but are there models or another model that allows thinking about trade, development, and profit that moves away from the logic of predation? There are also some questions about the possibilities of inclusive capitalism at all, or whether we should think of other processes, whether the productive and technological race among nations is a cause of the deterioration of the environment, and whether, in fact, the internationalization of the left is coming about through some of the current things that are going on, like the Democracy in Europe movement. Huge questions. I'm not expecting any of you to answer all of them, but you have basically approximately 1.5 minutes for your closing statements. I'm so sorry. Shall we do it the other way now? We can begin with Isabella and go backwards now. Go ahead, Isabella.
Sure, thank you. On the question of capitalism, I think it's important to remember that China, of course, entered some sort of a Faustian pact, and that the complexity and powers of the Chinese bureaucracy are incredibly important to take into account in this Faustian pact, especially if someone considers trying to replicate what China has done. Since this is also addressing young scholars, I think it's important to remember that development is not just a marginal issue that should be constrained to its own field of study, but that, as the debate on inflation has shown very clearly, really should be considered as part of the core curriculum. And I think this is an important demand and theme that I hope is being considered and discussed also in the young scholars initiative, so that it's not just about heterodox versus mainstream or post-Keynesian versus Marxist, but that the international dimension and the question of the global south is really core to any kind of rethinking or pluralizing economics. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Thanks so much, Isabella. Okay, Rob, your final thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, on the regional integration, I think that the African Continental Free Trade Area is not, unfortunately, very differentiated or asymmetrical. And as long as it remains a simple orthodox trade integration arrangement, it will create imbalances, which is why I think it needs to move in the direction of a developmental integration approach, where it actually focuses on the development of value chains in which there could be participants from several countries. On the question of capitalism, I would say that what we've had, and have had it in extreme form with neoliberalism, is that profits and profit seeking has been placed above the needs of the people in almost every area. That's why we have things like vaccine apartheid. It's also why I think we're behind the curve when it comes to addressing climate change, because those in seeking profits will embrace those parts of the agenda that they can make profits on, but they will resist those where they have to make adjustments. And so I think that the way forward has to be incrementally and progressively to place the needs of people above profits in a whole lot of areas, and have much more social direction and people's needs guiding developmental processes.
Thank you so much, Rob. That's terrific summation. Andrés, if you could, final thoughts.
Hey, well, first, thank you and everybody who has made this panel possible. It's been really a pleasure sharing this with you. I just wanted to say one thing and then quickly close. Do not forget, we just had the largest issuance of SDRs in the history of the world. And I think that does show that there is something that can be done, right? I mean, it's not perfect, it's too small. It took 17 months since the pandemic was declared a pandemic. But it happened, and it's going to be distributed by the end of this month. And I think there has to be a lot of effort from young scholars, from everybody here, to think about what can we do with these SDRs. There are many fundamental questions about SDRs, like why it took so long, why so little, but also why can't they be used more often to solve the world's problems, you know, like financing climate change, like eradicating hunger in the world. So that's a big issue that we have to consider in the coming months and years. Second, I think regional integration is key, especially for smaller countries like mine. I think that's an absolute element, and Rob has been very clear about that. But I think it has to, you know, the trade integration has to be accompanied with a planning and integration of planning and a common planning framework. Recall, development has to be planned, otherwise it can't be improvised, right? And here we have to consider, for example, Alianza del Pacífico. Sure, there may be some important elements there, but again, it includes an investor-state dispute settlement system that only favors foreign corporations, not the domestic corporations or the national champions. Second, we need to not only trade integration, but also labor integration, education integration, the possibility of women's integration, indigenous peoples integration, and of course, technological integration within the countries of Latin America and the South. So if we have trade as part of a larger regional plan of regional sovereignty, sure, that's an element that will contribute.
Thank you so much, Andrés. And then now, Anne.
So I want to say, yes, this is a question of capitalism. And what I think is that, you know, we cannot tackle the global Green New Deal within a capitalist framework. Capitalism has to fall. And can I say that the reason I'm saying that is that what we learned last year in COVID-19 was that capitalism couldn't deal with a global pandemic. And capitalism was essentially nationalized. It was nationalized by our central banks. You know, on March 20th, I think it was 2020, the shadow banking system collapsed. And indeed, capitalism would have been completely annihilated by this invisible virus if it had not been for the Federal Reserve, right? So we know that capitalism can't deal with pandemics. It cannot deal with a global, so, you know, it has to be pushed out of the way, because come those crises, and the thing I'd like to say is that we must be prepared. We must, you know, I was so shocked after the 2007-9 crisis. One of the reasons I'm here today is that I had the audacity to write a book predicting the crisis in 2005-6. And you know, and it felt like a lead balloon, and they said, who is this little girl? What is she talking about? But what shocked me about the left after 2007-8 was that we had no response. We were shocked, we were stunned. We didn't know it could happen. We didn't understand how the system worked. And so we said nothing. And so the system was consolidated, right? And so last year, you know, we nationalized capitalism, right? And now capitalism has got this massive public subsidy from central banks. And we're sitting back saying, oh dear, we've got a problem, right? We've got to understand that capitalism will not be able to deal with this, the biggest threat to human civilization. So it must be dismantled. And the question is, how do we dismantle it in an orderly way? Or if there's a crisis, how do we respond to that crisis? Thank you also, Jayati, for having me on. Thank you.
Terrific, and thank you. And so, Jamie, the last word is yours.
Well, one of the wisest people I ever met when I began my career on the congressional staff in the early 1980s was the chair of the Rules Committee, Richard Boulding. And he said to me the first time I went to see him, he said to me, once in a generation, you know, we have to buy back the capital stock. And I thought that was just it summarized the state of the world. Capitalism, in my view, doesn't exist anywhere in the advanced world. It collapsed over, you know, almost a century ago, and various things were rebuilt that have been functional. But if you like, a neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism system of global dominance, uneven development, and unbalanced trade. These things are the essence of the system. And neoliberalism is a set of doctrines that are exported from the north to the south in order to keep that system in place. They're not applied in the north to anywhere near the extent. And when the countries of the global south escape from them, well, that's a big problem. That's a big problem, because that essentially says that they are bringing themselves into a trajectory that can put them on a par with the existing centers of power and wealth. And the world just has to adjust to the fact that that's going to happen. There was an enormous push in my father's day in the early 1960s, really from the late 1950s, toward it was the independence of the countries of Africa and the other efforts, whatever you may think of them, the Alliance for Progress and so forth. And these things are now need to, this similar wave has to be coming, or we're all going to be in terrible trouble, because the globe as a whole will not survive the complete collapse of the more dangerous, endangered and vulnerable countries and peoples. So that's the challenge that we face. I could say a lot more. I would like to come back to Anne's comment about August 15th, 1971. I'll only say on that is that I do have a paper, and it's a paper I wrote in honor of Andrès and my very close friend, Eugenia Correa, a friend of all of us, I think, on this. And there's very sort of ambivalent character of that moment, which we all thought was a Keynesian moment at the time, but was in fact the opening shot of the neoliberal era. And that's how it developed. And it's a very interesting history to be aware of, because some things about the neoliberal approach are very enticing in the short run. So one has to be aware. This is not just it is not an unambiguous phenomenon from the standpoint of the people who are experiencing it. Okay, enough for me. Thanks very much. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you so much. It looks like we have now material for another several webinars to discuss all of these fascinating issues. I'm sorry for going beyond time. Sorry to Richard and to the organizers. It was so fascinating that I myself lost track of the time. So please forgive me. I'm going to hand over to Richard Kozel-Wright, who's the director of the Globalization and Development Division at UNCTAD. And thank you all for giving me this opportunity. I learned a lot. I thought it was terrific. Thank you.
Jayati, thank you very much. I think and thank you to all the panelists as well for participating. I think that was the kind of perfect way to end the summer school. I think it's the kind of conversation that we wanted to end the summer school with. The intention of the summer school, I guess in a way, was of course to celebrate the 40 years of the Trade and Development Report, both the broad range of issues that we have discussed over those years, and the independent spirit we have adopted in our approach to thinking about the development challenge and the kind of advice that we can give from our position to developing countries. I liked Isabella's notion of the need to constantly fight a guerrilla war on these fronts. And in a way, I think the TDR has been fighting a guerrilla war over the years, and I have to pay my thanks to the many people who have contributed to the Trade and Development Report over those years. It always has been and always will be a very collective effort. I should say that I should thank Jayati in particular as well for that. Jayati has been a member of, in a way, the TDR family for a number of years now, and has been an important contributor to the evolution of the report. But more than a kind of celebration simply of the TDR, I hope that the summer school has given kind of some ideas and some inspiration, certainly some encouragement to the coming generation of scholars and activists who are still going to have to take on orthodoxy and orthodox economic thinking in all its manifestations, which which, as the title of the summer school suggests, we have been swimming against that tide now for 40 years. I think it's true to say, and that neoliberalism, as Jamie suggested, is not dead, although it may be suffering from its own very serious health issues at the moment, and perhaps there is a sense also that the tide is turning towards alternatives, and I think it's important that we do have the ideas and the policies and proposals in place to help think about reshaping the world in a more inclusive, in a more just, and in a more sustainable manner. And I think the panel, demonstrated that there are lots of ideas and people out there thinking about what that might mean in the face of not just the traditional development challenges that we've talked about in the Trade and Development Report, but also in the context of the climate crisis that was also mentioned by everyone, and that we've begun ourselves to think about in the context of a global Green New Deal. I don't want to try and summarize the discussions in the panel or indeed the work that we're doing and continuing to do in the Trade and Development Report. I'm going to end with a quote which I think speaks to the moment in a particularly profound way, although it's nearly 50 years ago that Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in Washington in 1963. But part of that speech, he said, and let me quote, because I do think it's both apposite and encouraging. He said, "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are faced with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action." And I think that is the kind of spirit that I hope will continue to inform the work that we do in the Trade and Development Report. And I very much hope it's the spirit that young scholars at INET continue their work and advance alternatives, as I said, to an orthodoxy that has clearly failed, but is very hesitant to disappear from the stage. Let me just, by way of conclusion, I have to thank the heavy lifters who have put together this summer school, and without whom you wouldn't have enjoyed the various panels and follow-ups that have taken place over this week. Not surprisingly, they're all women. So a big thanks to Heskey, to Claire, to Gul, to Maria, and to Ursula, who have really carried the summer school forward this year. There will be a mentoring program that some of you have applied for, and INET will be in touch with those people that have been selected for that. I think next week Heskey may want to say something about that in a second. And of course the recordings for the various seminars are already available for those that want to go back and think again about some of the presentations that we had this week. Let me just then conclude by thanking you all for participating. We hope that it was a rich and useful experience for you all. We look forward to seeing you next year. We don't know what kind of format, obviously, that will take. We have adapted as best we could to this virtual world. Whether that continues next year, we will have to see. But again, thanks to you all for participating. We have to get back to this year's Trade and Development Report, which will be launched next month. We will try and give our reflections on the past 18 months and the challenges that has posed for policymakers, particularly in the South. We will also look the climate adaptation challenge, which will no doubt figure significantly in discussions in the run-up and beyond the Glasgow COP that will take place in early November. And again, we hope that the report will be able to bring its independent spirit and developmental thinking to that challenge. So again, thanks to everybody for participating, and I give the screen now to Heske for some final wrap-up comments.
Thank you so much, Richard, for these very inspiring last words. And thank you to the panel for sending us out with a bang. This very dynamic discussion. I'm sure it really left us all inspired. And I think we are all feeling that there remains a lot of work to be done. There remain a lot of questions to be answered, a lot of topics to be explored. So I'm very grateful that I can tell you I have good news regarding that, because the Young Scholars Initiative is really here to help you take those conversations forward and to continue to explore these themes. We really extend the invitation to all of you now to join us in the Young Scholars Initiative as a member, as a friend, as part of this global community, and to keep in touch and to continue these conversations. As you may know, the Young Scholars Initiative is already pretty sizable. We have 17,000 members around the world who are heavily involved in organizing talks, discussions, debates, workshops, you name it, a lot of which really embodies the same spirit that you would have experienced this week. So I just want to tell you, if you enjoyed this week, if you're filled up with inspiration and you think you need more, YSI is the place to get more and to create more for yourself and for your peers. So concretely, what I hope you take away is that we are about to go into a next session where we can explain to you a little bit of how that works, particularly what YSI can do for you in terms of making the kind of administrative and video conferencing tools available that the summer school ran on. We can provide those tools to you so that you can organize your own talks and discussions. We can put you in touch with people who may share similar interests so that you can collaborate on anything you want to take up. And we have people here who are actually at your disposal for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so to help you wrap your head around that and to help you better understand how that works. We have split up those sessions into different working groups. For a little bit of context, YSI is made up of 21 working groups that just mark some broad topical areas, some themes, so that we can organize activity within those themes. But I don't want you to take them too harshly. If you find yourself sort of between working groups, or you don't see a perfect fit of where you want to go and start, that's okay. Just start with the best one and know that YSI is really an open space for ideas, and that it's okay to kind of blend approaches. We often say that the thing we're trying to create in the Young Scholars Initiative is a playground of ideas where thoughts can flow freely. So we essentially are inviting you to come and play with us right now. So if this sounds interesting, don't go anywhere. Our hosts, as that you can see on the screen here, our organizers, they are queued up in these 7 different Zooms waiting for you to come and join them. And they're there to help you understand better how to get more involved in YSI, and they'll be curious to hear your ideas as well. So if you already know, wow, I was very, very inspired by this speaker, or I would really like to start a book club around this book, now is the time to voice those ideas to these organizers and to get their perspective on how you can make that happen. So I think we are going to put in the chat the actual Zoom links that you can use to enter into these particular rooms. And then from there, we can dream up plans into the indefinite future. So this need not be the end. This may just be the beginning. There's plenty of work to do and things to be explored. So thank you so much for joining us and continuing the legacy and the tradition and taking our inspiration forward. Thank you, everyone. See you in the Zooms.